So I'm thinking that James Patterson and Richard DiLallo must be really great guys, loved by their families, supported by their friends. They must have a big network of people who feel good about being around them and want to see them succeed. Because how else can you explain this abomination of storytelling known as Alex Cross's trial ever seeing the light of day, let alone being published, let alone becoming a bestseller, let alone getting a single unbiased five-star review? I usually hold the book up because I want to show you that I have a copy, but with this one, I either traded it in for a new book or I ripped it up and threw it in the garbage. I hate to think I recycled it, otherwise, the essence of the rotten storytelling might infect future stories written on paper. So, for starters, they must be really great guys because what a favor James Patterson did for Richard DiLallo by sticking his big all caps name on the trunk manuscript that DiLallo had floating around that no one else would publish. And it was this nepotism that brought the worst popular novel I've ever read into the public forum. And it's actually the best example of why people don't read, or when they try to read, if they come across something like this, they wonder what the big deal is, why anyone bothers, and it's just a waste of time, and they might as well just stick with their other mediums of entertainment. And we'll get into the reasons why. So, as far as what makes Alex Cross's trial so bad, it's about social injustices. And with all due respect to the real world victims of social injustice, I came away from this more affected by the atrocities that the authors committed against the reader. And that makes the book about social injustice a failure because the manner in which the story was told undermined and negated and made obsolete what the victims of social injustice have gone through. They need their story to be told by someone who has the platform, but more importantly, someone who can tell their story well. And that is exactly what this book fails so miserably at. They break every promise, the authors, every promise, every reason that you could have to care that is brought up, every reason they get you to care about what's going to happen is a broken promise. So, for starters, before the story even starts, the title is false advertising. Alex Cross's trial. Alex Cross isn't even in the book. He spends about a page and a half in the beginning saying, hey, this has nothing to do with me, but a guy from 100 years ago spent a couple days with my relatives in the past. So here, read his story, and thanks again for giving me money. And I wasn't even a fan of Alex Cross books when I went into this. And I was pissed. I can't imagine. This seems to be the big gripe about all the people reviewing it and the customer reviews, is that it was false advertising and they were expecting an Alex Cross book and didn't get it. And I didn't even care if it was an Alex Cross book or not. So this isn't even a big problem with me. But Rosemary's Baby can have no Rosemary's Baby. Can Rosemary's Baby be about a woman named Helen who pursues a career in tennis? Where's Rosemary's Baby? House on Haunted Hill? Wow, that sounds like a creepy, atmospheric book. Let's check it out. House on Haunted Hill is a cookbook? No, neither one of those things is true. It's false advertising, and you don't get what you paid for. It isn't Alex Cross's trial. It's Ben Corbett's trial, but that wouldn't sell as many copies. So, I was okay with it being Ben Corbett's trial, because as I said, I had no emotional investment in it being an Alex Cross book. The problem with it being Ben Corbett's trial is that this supposed alleged hero of the book who narrates the whole thing is actually one of the biggest villains. Remember Atticus Finch from To Kill a Mockingbird? He was portrayed through the eyes of his daughter, who saw him as a strong man, a good representative of a lawyer, stood up for the little guy and was moral. A good example of a man, a father, and a lawyer. Imagine if To Kill a Mockingbird had been written from the point of view of Atticus Finch and he was a whiny narcissist. Would anybody give two shits about that book today if that was the case? No. That's a good example. That's a good version of telling the story of victims of social injustice. But instead, in Alex Cross's trial, we get 300 pages of Ben Corbett saying, nobody likes me because I stand up for the little guy and I'm such a great guy and everyone hates me because they're not as good as me. Imagine that tone for 300 pages, and that's what's in store for you with Ben Corbett's trial. So, this whiny narcissist, on the subject of the tone-deaf narrative, the biggest, most egregious example of that is, I forgot which part it was. It's somewhere in the middle of the book, but I don't have it to reference because I tore it up and threw it in the garbage. It goes from part 2 to part 3, let's say. And part 2 ends with Ben Corbett discovering that a father and a son had been hanged to death from a tree. And that's the final image that the part ends with. Then, on the very next page, it says, Part 3, Southern Funeral Favorites. Is there a more jarring shift in tone from one page to the next? It completely undermines the horror of what just happened to these victims of social injustice. Would you end part 2 with, they looked at the dead body of the woman and found out that she had been raped 50 times until she was dead? Part 3, lipstick, short skirts, and lollipops. Now, you can end a part with a horrific scene and then title the next part appropriately. Like in The Shining, it ends part 3 with the 5-year-old kid facing a horrific situation, and then part 4, Snowbound. That works. That's not a jarring shift that completely undermines the horror of what the people went through a minute earlier. You're disrespecting the victims, and anyone who has really been through this kind of thing is going to be disgusted by that creative choice that you made, trying to show your humor and wit. So it's completely disgusting and disrespectful to any real-world victims who have either gone through that or know somebody who's gone through that or even has empathy for someone who's gone through that. Now, at the end of the book, and as it's probably going to say in the thumbnail, this is a spoiler-filled review because it doesn't really matter that I'm giving everything away. I want you to read it and see for yourself if everything I'm saying is true. And let me know what you think about it. At the end is one of the most egregious examples I've ever seen of a character betraying their own logic. It's Chris Watts level of a character betraying the character they're trying to portray with who they really are, and where the villainous Ben Corbett really rears his ugly head. It's after they've lost the trial because of the social injustice that permeates the town. What are we going to do? Well, what does our hero Ben Corbett do? He grabs the black woman who has supported him and housed him and helped him through this trial at the risk of her own safety. He takes her by the hand and runs her through the downtown, past all of the people who would victimize her, and he rubs it in their face by skipping along with her, kissing her in front of them, and just rubbing it in their noses that, look, we're a white man and a black woman, and we're proudly displaying that we can get along and do whatever we want in front of you, you racist people. Well, that might be heroic if Ben Corbett was going to stick around to protect the black woman, Moody. However, like a coward, he tucks his tail between his legs right afterwards and gets on a train and flees. and leaves her there to defend herself. She leaves her like a lamb to the slaughter, the woman who sheltered him and supported him through his whole trial and gave him tips that helped him, information that he needed. He forces her into this scenario unwillingly and unknowingly, putting her like a lamb to the slaughter in front of her townsfolk that already would be happy to see her victimized and now have even more reason to do so instead of sticking around to protect her. After that, he gets on a train and goes home. What a hero. What a guy. He's such a great guy. How could anybody not like him? How could his family want to leave him because he's poor, because he sticks up for all the little people and wants to give them justice? Oh, this hero. He really stuck it to them. By the way, we never learn what became of Moody, the woman. But I assume it's going to be more horrifying than anything else, any of the crimes that Ben Corbett was trying to bring justice to. He was the cause of it. So maybe he never committed any of the acts of violence that he was against. He has that going for him. But he's just as hypocritical and just as much of a scumbag and a lowlife morally as any of them. He just doesn't commit the physical violence himself, but he will arrange things to make the violence happen. Even to the people who have supported him the most. Is there anybody lower than somebody who pretends to be a hero while actually being a greater villain than those they presume to oppose? I don't think so. Now there's been this one open thread dangling through the whole story. Oh, his horrible, misunderstanding family that won't support him as he defends the little guy in his quest for social justice. They've been threatening to leave him, and they haven't communicated him since he's been out of town on this trial for weeks. They just ignored him, and what's going to happen? How's he going to get out of this? How's he going to resolve this? Is he ever going to get his family back? Well, what happens? Nothing. This villain gets a hero's welcome, and his family that just denounced him and ignored him through the toughest time of his life welcomes him home with open arms. They come running into each other's arms. All is forgiven for no reason. It's never mentioned why. Because there doesn't need to be a reason, because James Patterson's name is on it. And because Alex Cross's trial is going to make people buy it and read it regardless of how horrible and dishonest the storytelling ends up being. So, just when you couldn't be any more disgusted with this Ben Corbett fiasco of a trial, of a story that undermines all the real world victims through everything I've already mentioned. On top of that, not only does he get the hero's welcome for being the biggest villain for no reason, even as a literary work, there's no reason to read this. There's no reason that it would win over anybody who likes reading. It's 2-page chapters, so it moves along really quickly, but it's written in a way that, like somebody is describing a movie or a show that they're watching. Just this person did this, and then this person did this, and then this person did this. And sparingly with the hero's observations of how horrible everybody else is and what a great guy he is. There's no insight, there's no psychological depth, there are no illuminating descriptions of human nature or just the world in general. It's just a very bland, superficial narrative by a bland, superficial human being. Not the authors, maybe they've done better, and I'm sure they're great guys because they would have to be for anybody to want to promote this into the public forum. I'm talking about Ben Corbett, the narrator. It's anorexic narrative. There's no reason. You pretty much read it just to see what's going to happen, and then after you know what happens, there's no reason to ever reread it. It has none of the qualities that I talked about in the other books in my book reviews, where it's not an example of why reading can be a more satisfying medium of entertainment. It doesn't have that quality. So all it gives any critic of reading is a reason to criticize reading. why wouldn't I just read? This is like watching a movie or a show, only it takes longer and there's no visual in front of me. It's like a video game that I have no control of with no graphics. It's just superficial, no depth from a superficial character with no depth. Just morally bankrupt, without insight. No reason to read it. So, if you haven't read it, you might just be saying, Mike, I think you're just jealous that this book has gotten success that you may never get in your life. Mark my words. If the biggest publishing company in the world were to come to me and say, Mike, we will give you James Patterson money, all you have to do is put your name on this book that is every bit as good as Alex Cross's Trial, I would turn down that offer every day of the week, with the one exception of if everything in my life just fell apart and my family had nowhere to go and my kids were starving and that deal came along right then I might, if I had no other options, I might do it just to keep my kids from starving. And then, as soon as my family was out of that financial hole, I would try to get out of the offer and get out of the deal, because given the choice between those two evils, I would rather be known as a guy who would go back on his word and betray his own stance just for money than to be known as the author of something of the quality of Alex Cross's Trial. So you should read this book. Don't take my word for it. See for yourself and let me know what you think. And I apologize if you agree with me.